October 24th, 1944. Vosges Mountains, France. The forest was silent. Too silent. No bird sang, no wind rustled the trees. Just the sound of breathing, shallow and ragged, for men who had not slept in days. They were crouched behind fallen logs, huddled in shallow foxholes, gripping their rifles with frozen hands. Around them, the German army waited, guns aimed, ready to kill anyone who moved. The men were surrounded, cut off, trapped. They had no food, no water, almost no ammunition. The wounded lay on the ground, groaning softly, bleeding into the dirt. The Germans had been shouting at them for hours, demanding surrender. Some of the men wondered if they should. Some wondered if they would live to see tomorrow. But their commander, a young lieutenant named Marty Higgins, refused to give up. He had sent a message back to headquarters days ago. It was simple. "We are surrounded. Send help." But help had not come. And now, the men were starting to wonder if it ever would. They called themselves the Lost Battalion. 500 men, cut off deep behind enemy lines, fighting for survival in one of the most brutal battles of World War II. The Germans wanted them dead, the forest wanted them dead, even the weather seemed to want them dead. But another unit, far behind the lines, refused to let them die. They were the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit made up entirely of Japanese-American soldiers. And they were about to attempt the impossible, break through the German lines, fight their way up a mountain, and rescue men who had already been written off as lost. This is the story of 500 men who were left to die, and the 200 soldiers who refused to let that happen. The Lost Battalion was not actually a battalion. It was the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Infantry Division. They were Texans, most of them. Farm boys, factory workers, small-town kids who had signed up to fight the Nazis. They had landed in France in the summer of 1944, fought their way through the hedgerows of Normandy, and pushed into the mountains of eastern France by October. The Vosges Mountains were brutal. Thick forests, steep hills, freezing temperatures, and endless rain. The Germans had dug in, fortified their positions, and turned every ridge into a killing zone. The American advance had slowed to a crawl. But the commanders at headquarters wanted results. They wanted the division to keep pushing, keep advancing, no matter the cost. On October 24th, 1944, the 1st Battalion was ordered to attack a German position deep in the forest. The plan was simple: push forward, take the high ground, and hold it until reinforcements arrived. The battalion moved out, advancing through the trees, expecting support on their flanks. But that support never came. The units on either side were pinned down by German fire. And the 1st Battalion, now deep in enemy territory, found themselves alone. By nightfall, the Germans had encircled them. Over 500 men were trapped on a hillside, surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered them 5-1. Lieutenant Marty Higgins radioed headquarters, reporting their situation. He was told to hold their position. Reinforcements were on the way. But the reinforcements never came. For the next 5 days, the battalion held that hillside. They dug foxholes in the frozen ground. They rationed their food, splitting single rations between 3 or 4 men. They melted snow for water. They fired their rifles sparingly, knowing that every bullet counted. And they waited. The Germans did not wait. They attacked again and again, trying to overrun the American position. They fired mortars into the hillside, shredding trees and men alike. They sent snipers into the forest, picking off anyone who moved. They shouted in English, trying to trick the Americans into revealing their positions. "Give up," they yelled.
"You are surrounded! You will all die!"
But the battalion did not give up. They fought back with everything they had. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Medics crawled through the dirt, dragging wounded men to cover. Officers moved from foxhole to foxhole, encouraging their men, keeping them calm. And Lieutenant Higgins, the battalion commander, sent message after message back to headquarters. "We are still here. We are still fighting. Send help." But no help came. By the fourth day, the situation was desperate. The men had run out of food. They had almost no ammunition left. The wounded were dying, one by one, from blood loss and infection. Some men, delirious from hunger and exhaustion, started to hallucinate. Others simply stared into the forest, waiting for the end. Back at headquarters, the commanders knew the battalion was in trouble. They had tried to send reinforcements, but every attempt had been turned back by German fire. They had tried airdrops, but the supplies landed in German territory. They had tried artillery support, but the shells fell short, killing American soldiers instead of Germans. The commanders began to discuss the possibility that the battalion was lost, that there was nothing they could do. But then, someone suggested calling in the 442nd. They said it wasn't as all of them. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was unlike any other unit in the American Army. It was made up entirely of Japanese American soldiers, most of them from Hawaii and California. They had volunteered to fight, even though their families had been locked up in internment camps back home. They had been told they were not trusted, that they were not real Americans, that they would never be good enough. And they had spent the entire war proving everyone wrong. By October 1944, the 442nd had earned a reputation as one of the toughest, most aggressive units in the European theater. They had fought in Italy. They had liberated French towns. They had taken casualties at a rate higher than almost any other unit in the Army. And they had never, ever failed a mission. When the commanders asked the 442nd to rescue the Lost Battalion, they did not hesitate. They had just finished another brutal fight and were supposed to be resting. But rest could wait. 500 men were trapped, and the 442nd was going to bring them home. The firefighters stayed for light and long, but fell over the top. The mission was a nightmare from the start. The 442nd had to fight their way up a mountain, through thick forest, against entrenched German positions. The Germans knew they were coming. They had machine guns covering every approach. They had mortars zeroed in on every ridge. They had snipers in the trees. And they were determined to stop the 442nd before they could reach the Lost Battalion. The 442nd attacked anyway. They moved through the forest in small groups, using the trees for cover. They crawled through mud and snow. They charged German positions head-on, fighting with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. They took casualties, heavy casualties, but they did not stop. Every time they hit a German position, they destroyed it and kept moving. Every time they were pinned down, they called in artillery and pushed forward. They fought for 48 hours straight, without rest, without relief, driven by one simple mission: rescue the Lost Battalion. On October 30th, 1944, 6 days after the battalion had been surrounded, soldiers from the 442nd broke through the German lines and reached the trapped men. The Americans on the hillside, half-starved and barely conscious, could not believe it. They had been told reinforcements were coming for days. They had stopped believing it. But now, Japanese American soldiers were pouring into their position, bringing food, water, ammunition, and hope. The rescue was not clean. The Germans did not give up. They continued to shell the position, trying to kill the rescuers and the rescued alike. The 442nd had to fight their way back out, carrying the wounded, covering the retreat, holding off German counterattacks. By the time they made it back to friendly lines, the 442nd had lost over 800 men, killed, wounded, or missing. It was one of the highest casualty rates of any single operation in the war. But they had done it. Of the 500 men who had been trapped on that hillside, Over 200 were rescued. It was not all of them. Many had been killed in the fighting, others had died from their wounds, but hundreds of men who would have died were brought home. And it was because the 442nd refused to quit. The rescue of the Lost Battalion became one of the most famous operations of the war. The soldiers of the 36th Division, Texans who had been raised in a world of segregation and prejudice, owed their lives to Japanese American soldiers who had been treated as enemies in their own country. The irony was not lost on anyone. Some of the rescued men wept when they saw their rescuers. Others simply shook their hands and said, "Thank you." After the war, the survivors of the Lost Battalion spoke about what the 442nd had done. They told their families, their friends, anyone who would listen. And slowly, the story spread. The 442nd, which had been dismissed and doubted, became one of the most decorated units in American military history. They earned more medals, more commendations, more honors than almost any other regiment. And they earned something even more important: respect. The story of the Lost Battalion is not just about survival. It is about loyalty, about refusing to abandon people even when the odds are impossible, about fighting for people who might not have fought for you. The soldiers of the 442nd had every reason to quit. They had been mistreated, imprisoned, doubted, but they did not quit. They fought harder than anyone. And when 500 men were left to die, they went in and brought them home. Today, the rescue of the Lost Battalion is taught in military academies. It is studied as an example of courage, determination, and sacrifice. And it is remembered as proof that heroism has no race, no background, no origin. It is simply the willingness to fight for others, even when no one is fighting for you. They called them the Lost Battalion. 500 men, surrounded, cut off, left to die. But they were not lost, because 200 soldiers refused to let them be.